Welcome to the first webinar of the series Connecting to Reimagine, Money and COVID-19. I'm Anna Lusardi, the founder and academic director of the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Center here in Washington, D.C. And as the title of the series indicates, we are connecting thought leaders and others around the world to discuss some of the most pressing topics we all face today due to the pandemic. This crisis gives us an opportunity to reimagine our future, to change course, I would say, and perhaps build better. The topic that we have chosen for today's webinar is a very important one, navigating retirement security through a pandemic. And we have invited three extraordinary speakers with us today. Two of them, Diana Crossan and Elsa Fornero, were the architects of their pension system in New Zealand and Italy, respectively. And Chris Battaglia brings an overview, a keen overview of the US system and also of the system around the world. So I have a set of questions for them, but we are also very interested in hearing from you. So I'm going to try to leave certainly quite a bit of time at the end of a first list of questions to our speakers. So please, you can start asking your questions in the Q&A if you'd like to also participate to this debate, and we will also turn to your questions soon. But let me start, and I'd like to start with Diana, that many countries around the world have allowed their citizens to basically withdraw funds from their retirement account. So, of course, this might solve short-term problems, but it affects retirement security in the long term. So how can we reshape? We want to look into the future. We want to rebuild the future. We want to reimagine our future. How can we reshape the retirement system so it is more crisis-proof?
Well, kia ora tātou, kia ora. Hello, everyone around the world. It's amazing to be sitting in New Zealand and talking with you all. First, one thing, Anna Maria, I was just one of a team that set up the KiwiSaver, and I know my colleagues who may be watching me to think that I was the architect of it would be challenging me about that. I also want to acknowledge that my comments will mostly be about what's happening in the Western world, the developed world, or the richer countries. This pandemic is global and it affects countries differently all over the world. And we all know that in countries in Africa, South America, and parts of Asia will be affected catastrophically in a way that the rest of us will not be. So mostly I'm focusing on the so-called Western world. I have two parts to answer that question about how do we reimagine or how do we reset the retirement income framework. The first one is that it's not only the retirement income framework that needs to be crisis ready. And we know, for example, that employment has been hugely affected, and employment systems need to be looked at, and governments I know around the world are saying, how can we look after people? How can we retrain? How can we support people in the crisis now and in the future? Health systems, and we'll come back to that, but health systems have been affected. Some people, for example, see the pandemic as a way to, the way they deal with it is a way to save lives, and others are saying it's affecting the economy too much, and so there is a tension between those two things. Housing, for example, countries and economies need to think about, do we let banks foreclose on mortgages, or can we help people stay in their housing through this? And family violence, there's a whole lot of issues around the social fabric of our society. So my first answer is it's not just the retirement income framework that needs to be reset or ready for crisis. But looking at the framework, I think it's important for us to, I mean, some people would say, and that take out your retirement savings, you may never get to retirement. This pandemic may deal to us all. Now, I don't believe that. So I do want to focus on how we can support people and to hold on to their retirement savings. The population, for one thing, I think from government, the population needs to know that their retirement income is secure, whether it's a public pension or whether it's through the private sector. So people are looking for security from their government. And we know in New Zealand, for example, there were many, many, many applications to KiwiSaver on hardship the moment the pandemic struck. But because we've got a very clear law and very clear definitions, very, very few of them were successful. So it is, I think, about making sure that your system will stand up in such cases. So long answer, but an important question.
No, certainly, you know, we just need to make all the other system around the retirement system more crisis proof, and these are very important points. So I'd like to turn to Elsa now, because of course countries are dealing differently with this. So Elsa, from your perspective, what can we say?
Well, first of all, I have to say that I'm very pleased to participate in this webinar. I'm talking from Italy, and it is really a pleasure to have people from New Zealand, from Washington, and maybe all over the world to listen. Second, I have to say that I'm not the architect of the Italian pension system. As a minister, I prepared in very, very difficult circumstances because it was, we were on the edge of a financial crisis. It was autumn 2011, and I prepared a pension reform. And reforms generally mean restructuring the pension system, which is something that people do not really like. It's not a very popular measure to take. But talking about the consequences of COVID on pension, retirement security, I certainly agree with Diana. The first problem now is employment. The first problem are incomes, people incomes from employment. And I have to say that as far as I can understand, there have been different responses to the COVID crisis from Europe, and certainly in Italy, than in the US. I mean, Europe is the continent of the welfare state. And although the welfare state has gone through a crisis with difficulties to adjust to population aging and so on, is still there. So it was quite natural to the government to try and protect the people. So the answer here was first an almost complete lockdown, which meant the firms were closed and workers were put on a special scheme, which, dismissals in Italy were prohibited. In many other European countries were very much restricted, so that workers could still have at least a part of their income as a government subsidy. So the first response was giving liquidity to both firms and workers. And this somehow worked, and it's a state protection. So going to your questions, here people were not asked to rely on their own pension funds, retirement savings to face the crisis, to finance their consumption, but could rely on government. And this, for the emergency, is the right answer, I believe. But of course, it cannot continue. And so we have to restore production and all the activities. The second thing I just want to mention for this is that our pension systems in Europe are on a pay-as-you-go basis. So you don't really have funds that you can rely on when you need. These are promises, public promises, because the system collects contributions and then pay pensions, and that's all. And indeed, in many countries, the contributions are not enough to pay for pensions. So it's difficult for people. Don't think of getting on their pension wealth to finance their consumption today in the difficult circumstances. But there is everywhere in Europe and also a bit in Italy, what we call, let's say, pension funds, that is supplementary retirement savings. And these are based on financial funding. And so people did not draw wealth from there, but certainly they hurt their security because many of them simply did not contribute any longer. So they will lack these contributions, and this will mean less private pensions and also a bit less public pensions. So it's a problem, but, and I stop here, the main problem now is recovering employment, production and employment, and thus people's income.
Absolutely. So two critically important points. There is an effect on retirement security in any way due to this pandemic. And, the other part of the system also contribute to the fragility of this financial security in the long term. So, Chris, the pandemic is a global health crisis, but we should also think more of the health cost even after the pandemic and include them, right, in the reshaping of the retirement system. And I'm speaking, of course, in particular from the US perspective, but this is true also around the world. Coming back to the point of Diana, all the health system is very linked in a sense to also the retirement security.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question, and thank you for inviting me to participate. I have to say, I feel very humbled to be on this panel with only 35 years of experience in these sort of financial markets and this media. As they say, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I definitely feel quite humbled to be among the three of you. And I refer to Dame Diana Crossan and Elsa Maria Fornero as my pension heroes, retirement heroes. So the work that you do is so important, and really appreciate that and appreciate the comment. So I first like to acknowledge a few things, as Elsa Fornero said. The employment issue is the real crux of it in terms of what we're seeing now with COVID-19 and the pandemic. And these are the critical links, because at least in most systems around the world, this is the link to the retirement benefit and the health benefit at your place of employment, and is a really important pillar. Not the only one, of course, not the only one, but a very important one. And so I think this is something which is a real teaching moment for everybody around the world in terms of what employment will look like, going forward. And the implications are enormous. And my own personal opinion is, at the beginning of the pandemic, some friends of mine asked me, Chris, what do all pandemics have in common? And I said, well, what is that? And they said, well, they all end. And I thought, okay, well, that's certainly true. If you look back on all the pandemics, and I think we're still at a real pivotal point now where, yes, many people have lost their jobs, but what happens next? And what happens next with regard to the provisions for loans and withdrawals from retirement plans. And in the US's case, what we have is a pocket of growing assets called health savings accounts, HSAs, which are largely connected to those in high deductible health plans. And so I think, you know, these are the real critical issues going forward, is that we have to take stock of what this crisis is telling us. It's certainly not over. So far, the response to the US's CARES Act, which does have a provision for withdrawals from retirement plans, has been fairly muted, meaning compared to what it looked like with emergency withdrawals during the credit crisis of 2008 and 2007, 2008, what we're seeing now is a fairly muted response, but so far. And I think, you know, Elsa Fornero mentioned this, a very, very important point. What happens next with employment? And that's a key thing. You know, if we see higher levels of unemployment, so on and so forth, we're going to be in a much more of a crisis mode. And with regard to crisis, I would like to make one small comment and tell you a very, very quick 30-second story. I notice everyone has books in their offices. You can't see my bookshelf here because it's above me. But at our home headquarters in pensions and investments in New York City, we have many conference rooms filled with books by many scholars and many academics and many investment professionals. And we had such a large collection. Our company was founded in 1973, right before the US passed ERISA, our pension legislation. And so if you can imagine, we receive every single book that comes in from every author that has an opinion or a solution to what's going on with global retirement issues. And I can tell you, when we moved our offices a few years ago, we had to purge some of these books. And I would say 8 out of 10 books going back to the 1970s had some thesis or position about a looming crisis. What we're hearing now is nothing new. And I think this is one of the things that's kind of disturbing to me, is that we still haven't really solved for this problem. And I think we need to think more holistically about it. I know we might talk about that a little bit later on, but I think there's a key link with the healthcare system for obvious reasons. As we know that longevity and low interest rates are driving a major source of challenge for the industry. And these issues are really inextricably linked. So take heed to this moment, I would say, and let's figure out what we can learn really quickly. Try not to make too many mistakes with regard to legislation in terms of knee-jerk reactions to situations that could have implications somewhere down the line, like somehow fracturing the security of retirement savings. You know, overall, we are seeing higher savings rates, and in general, in the US at least, people have become much better savers over time for reasons we can get into a little bit later. But there's a lot of things that are working well in the system. My point would be, we need to look at it a bit more holistically, and healthcare definitely needs to be more of a subject that we bring into the discussion when we talk about solutions.
Thank you. And this actually leads me to the next topic, which is exactly linked to this, which is that according to our research, people were financially fragile even before the pandemic hit. So many would have not been able to face a small shock, let alone a big one. So I'm going to turn again to Diana and ask, how can we make people more financially resilient? And I have to say, I'm looking at the question, of course, people are asking, what are some of the solutions? So we will discuss some of the solutions, but let's start indeed with these important questions. I mean, as Chris said, it's not that, the previous situation was ideal. Crises were looming anyway, and there was financial fragility. So as we look forward, what can we do?
Okay, so first of all, COVID-19 has reminded us that we don't know what will happen next. And I will say that while we've had crisis before, this has to be the most global of all, because the credit crisis probably didn't affect parts of the world where they don't even know what the word credit means, and so on. But this is a health crisis, and it has affected everybody. And so I think one thing to grab is to say that it is a teachable moment, as Chris said. we need to push the idea, I think, of saving for a rainy day, and for people to understand, had they had a little bit more set aside, they would get through this time better. Although, of course, we don't know how long it will last, but one of the things we have been talking about in financial education and financial literacy for some time is managing your risk. And one of the risks is that there will be a crisis in your life, whether it's an individual crisis, a community one, or a national one like this. Not only for individuals and families, however, one of the things we've noted is that it's affected small business just as much. And we've found, quite surprisingly, I suppose, that small businesses weren't even prepared to have a week's salary saved. So if they went under quickly, and some did, when borders were closed and lockdown happened, all of a sudden they had no business. Some businesses didn't even have enough to pay the next week's salary, and let alone their producers or their contractors, their suppliers. Some governments around the world have noted this quickly and have put in place support through the lockdown and into the end of this year, support for wage support, but also for small businesses. And I know that in New Zealand, there's a fund for small businesses to reset their business, to rethink, to have access to strategists to help them rethink their business so they don't have to let all their staff go and close down. So how that will work, it'll be interesting to watch, but I think it is a huge teachable moment. When we look back at what the word teachable moment means, comes from discussions in the 1950s about you learn when you need to learn, and we certainly need to learn now.
I'm going to turn to you, Chris, now, because I've heard you speak about this integrated approach. And so tell us a little bit more, yet again, here, how this integrated approach can help us here.
Well, I thank you for the question. I think it ties in some of the elements everyone has been speaking about to some extent, but also, you know, the great work that you've done, Anna Maria, with regard to financial education and literacy. You know, if you think back to, let's just take the sort of health education, for example. I mean, it was the U.S. President John F. Kennedy who basically put, you know, health as something into the education system, where, you know, your well-being, your physical well-being needed to be something that should be part of the education system. And then what followed were the other elements, right? I remember as a young child, you know, the food pyramid and the right foods to eat to take care of your health and so on and so forth, how many grains you should have, what dairy you should have, meat and vegetables, so on and so forth. What have we given people to understand at that age about financial literacy and those basic building blocks of how to manage and integrate these things together? And again, that's what I'm speaking about with regard to integration. I mean, they're inextricably linked in terms of how you manage it. And then if you look into the systems themselves, you know, whether it's the US or Europe or I'm sure in New Zealand, my hope would be that there would be more collaboration within the stakeholders when we are coming together for solutions, as opposed to just going to one pot or another to quickly solve some sort of crisis or a monetary problem. And I think, you know, those are the things that, you know, I think about that are really important. You look at the great work that's been done. I spoke a little while ago about how the U.S. savers have really come along quite nicely. I mean, there were decades of learning of what to do and what not to do with regard to financial education. And, you know, much of the industry in the 80s and 90s was really focused on trying to help people be investors. And we knew that was wrong. That was a real failed attempt. What we needed to do was to think more about behavioral economics and other elements to help people move into products that would help them. And they don't need to understand the product necessarily, just as you don't need to understand how a car works necessarily, but you know you're going to get in it. The accelerator is going to be on the right. The steering wheel is going to be in front of you, kind of thing.
No.
And so all of these elements, and I take that, by the way, from my friend Bob Merton, who is at MIT, and you know he spoke much more eloquently about this last week at one of our conferences. But you know I think the integration of these concepts and these ideas would help us a lot. If we have an audience of regulators and legislators, my appeal would be get in a room together with your colleagues and really look at where the common denominators are and the overlapping nodes before some sort of policy change happens, to understand what the implications are.
That's very important indeed, and you know these coordinations I think is particularly needed during this pandemic. But I'm going to turn now to Elsa and talk about one important part of any policy, which is, you know, it's always one size fits all. But of course, you know, policy affects people differently. One example here is that, you know, if people withdraw from their retirement account and they are 2 to 3 years away from retirement, the effect is very different if you are a young workers. So what can we do also to make sure that, you know, people in a sense are better program or better communications as well of these policies so that, you know, we can help individual rather than harm their financial security in the long term?
Well, certainly, as I said, as far as governments have concentrated on the pandemic response, the emergency, that was relatively easy. I mean, it seems an understatement, and it is, but it's much easier when you can pile up debt, say, okay, now stay at home and you will have somebody taking care of you. The problem is how to make the economy not in the medium long run, but in the next month to recover. So the first thing to say to people is we need the economy to recover, so we need again to grow. And some countries in Europe have been growing more steadily in the past. Some others, I'm thinking of the Mediterranean countries, Italy, Spain, Greece, have been somehow left behind. So we need to recover. But the second message, you talk of communication, which goes along with a strategic view. So the second point in communication is people have to understand that as a country, as a nation, we are not alone now. Maybe we were more in the past, but now we are within a European Union which is side by side, which has made some solidarity possible, which has given us many more possibilities. And this is very important, Anna, because of what you know. There are movements in Europe and in Italy that are nationalist, that are populist, that are giving the wrong message. So again, we are within Europe, we are within the European Union to recover growth. Third message, the small growth we had before was compatible with an increase in inequality. And this has to be reduced. Inequality in two aspects, intragenerational, but also inequality within intergenerational inequality. And this, the point that government should have in mind when dealing with their strategic view, is that the young has suffered more, first from the Great Recession, and now from COVID. Losing, for example, periods, long periods of school, of education is terrible. And it is particularly terrible for the young, for the children of the more fragile families, because rich families can help their children in different ways. If schools are not there providing the usual education, but more fragile families are going to replicate their fragility with respect to their children. So this is the view that has to take us European, I would say, to move towards a more sustainable growth. You know that there is a plan for the green transition, and the green transition is again a very, very important piece of the overall picture, because it indicates a strategic view of where we want to go. There are all the digitalization problems. It's an opportunity, but it also creates problems, and also, well, many others. We need to see this. We need to communicate this longer view to the people, because if there is little understanding of the strategic view and what is necessary to do along with sustaining people now in the pandemic, then it will be almost impossible to reach these goals.
So I'm turning now already to questions that people have been asking, which is of course the most pressing question, which is what can we do, right? What can even the policymakers or the financial industry or others do to basically help people rebuild their financial security? So I'm going to ask kind of each of you to provide that piece of suggestions and information, as now I take a lot more questions. So please put your question in the Q&A, and I'll try to read those questions to our speakers. But I'll start with you, Diana.
Okay, so one of the things we need to note, we do have a new set of unemployed people. This pandemic has affected a different group of people. All nations have had issues with employment and unemployment, and people that are generations unemployed. But this brings to us a whole new set of people to deal with. And I think policymakers can make a difference. And one of the things they can make a difference is they can, well, this all has to be paid for. We know that. And they can make a difference by making sure that the gap between the haves and the have-nots doesn't grow. So I think Elsa pointed this out, that finding ways of sharing the load that this pandemic has brought upon us. The government can be involved in retraining, and I think I was pleased to see in several countries retraining programs were set up immediately, because some industries will just not recover for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, and people need work now. The teachable moment should not be wasted, and policymakers can use it, encourage precautionary savings, for example, managing risk. I think it's important. Because I want to make this comment, I'll do it now. I think one of the good things about the timing of this, you've talked about Europe being more together. One of the other things is that people around the developed world, the so-called developed world, know what financial literacy is, what financial education is. If we'd had this pandemic 15 to 20 years ago, we'd have been struggling to get to people to understand what they need to do. So there are lots of materials, lots of programs that just need tweaking. They don't need to be, we don't need to start again. Many of the materials are relevant today as they were 10 years ago. But we've got an opportunity to get to schools. We've got an opportunity to talk to workplaces to say, you can help your employees. And people are looking for ways to help their employees. We can talk to communities and city governments and all sorts who are trying to spread the load a bit by giving people this financial education conversation by setting up programs in workplaces and pushing to get it into schools. As you can imagine, Anna Maria, I could go on for a long time about this, but this is a very awful thing has happened to the world, but it's given us a great opportunity.
And Chris, we have discussed together, like in the past, that, if left to themselves, probably workers are not going to put back this money, right, into the retirement account. So what can we do to help also rebuild that financial security?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, a lot of this, it comes down to, of course, basic education and basic tenets of education, as Diana has mentioned, and Elsa and you. But I think there's also now some really much better tools and technology in terms of how we're viewing what happens next. And we've learned a lot from behavioral economics and behavioral finance with the nudge effects, right? Some of the things have worked extremely well in parts of the world with regard to improving the people's ability to save automatically, like the default options and the auto escalations programs that have been put into the United States. I think we need to think more carefully about these kind of mechanisms if we're going to be looking at certain pots to pull from or allowing employees and participants to be able to do these things. So what happens next? Is there a way to escalate them back into a savings plan so they can make up the gap? It's something that should be automatic without them thinking about it. Something that is helpful to their recovery where they don't have to think about it or remember it. And again, I think these are the things that, as Diana said, really smartly, if this had happened 15 or 20 years ago, I think we would have a much more difficult time. We have the benefit of learning some really important things in the retirement industry and the pension industry. So we've got to take heed of what has worked. We've got to figure out how we can use that going forward to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences somewhere down the line. And those very important concepts, the great work on the financial literacy and education side needs to continue to increase, right? So young people particularly are very anxious. We're all anxious. We don't know what's going to happen. But how do you relieve some of that anxiety and that friction? You do it with education and learning. If you understand, as you smartly said at the beginning, Anna Maria, what do you need to save, for an emergency, just basic things like that, you would have, I think, a very different outcome, and you would have quite frankly, a very different mental health state globally for people, because they will feel naturally more prepared. And, those are things that are actionable, that are teachable, that we have concepts for in education that we know work. And we certainly need to do more of that, like take heed of what's working, but do more of that. And then just be really cognizant of some of these unintended consequences when policies can and do change, and make sure that we have mechanisms in place that are automatic. And I think that's the key thing, is that people will move on to something else. They will forget. They might forget to save again. They might not really fully understand the consequences of them doing something. So I think education is key. And then the role, of course, with technology and using things like smartphones and other mechanisms, again, are at our disposal today that we didn't have years ago, that should make our jobs easier to help protect people and help them do better, particularly with the concept of covering the informal sector. And I know that was mentioned a few times. I think this is another really important issue, is that we need to think more carefully about closing that gap in terms of the have and have-nots, and figuring out a way to get coverage for people in places where they might not have an employment plan. And I do believe the future is in some sort of technology solution that's rooted in behavioral finance concepts.
And Elsa, how about you? How about some of your suggestions, also coming from your policymaker perspective?
Well, if I look at my own country, if I consider the perspective of a country who was structurally relatively weak before the 2008 crisis and before the pandemic. So I would think that the key word for us is investment. And we need to start with public investment. And people, but also politicians, and even politicians in government have to learn what investment is, because sometimes you hear that there is a public expenditure program, and they said we have invested in this program. For example, financing subsidy, which is an important thing, financing subsidies when they are needed, but that is not an investment. An investment means that you sacrifice something today in order to have something better or bigger tomorrow. So there is this, what we economists call this intertemporal element that has to be taken into account. And we have a lot of infrastructures. We think of hospitals, think of the health network in Italy, but also in many other European countries. Germany has invested a lot, but we are not yet now, as of now, at the level of investment in terms of GDP we were before the recession, so more than 15 years ago. So investment in infrastructures, investment in the green transition, because we have to take this very seriously. And I will tell you another things on this just in a minute. But then also investment in transforming our firms, giving them the possibility to gain productivity, because with productivity we may pay workers a higher salary, because salary is attached to productivity. And if productivity is stagnant, then it is difficult to increase salaries. Then investment in education, and then investment in research. For example, there was a letter signed by many scientists here asking our government to increase the share of GDP which is destined to research, because we are far behind what France or Germany spend in research. And this is very important, because research is a source of growth, even if it's not clear when it will be, but it will come. And talking of the investment in education, you know that sometimes we, for many reasons, invest in education for women, and then we left them simply out of the economy. So we waste our investment socially, and that is very bad. But as I said before, people have to be involved in this. And you know perfectly well that people feel the green economy in a kind of passionate way. But if you talk about sustainability of, for example, important institutions as public pensions, they are not interested. They think that it's the government that has to provide sustainability, social and economic and financial sustainability to this intergenerational contract, which is not, it's the economy. Because you may have the most marvelous political promises, but if they are not supported by a good economic environment, good labor income, then they are almost nothing. So you need investment, and the part of investment is talking to the people, communicate transparently with them, and also teach them the basic element of the economy, of finance, of what they need to learn to have a better life cycle.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to leave, I think, with these 3 words that you have mentioned, that to reimagine and to rebuild better, we need to retrain. We need to make it very easy for people to be able to put the money back into their retirement account or to save again for their future, and invest in people, invest in firms, invest in education, invest in research. I think this is such a powerful way to really say, how can we indeed rebuild better? So first of all, let me thank you, these extraordinary speakers today. If we haven't answered all of the questions, I will actually make sure I will send some of these questions, some of the answer back to here, or maybe ask you again. There was unfortunately some of the questions we didn't have time to answer. But first of all, thank you again for being here with us. And I want to invite you to the next webinar, which will be in November. And we will touch upon other important topics like this one. So thank you again for participating. Thank you for the audience. I know that they have been here steadily throughout this time. And I hope that this discussion today has contributed to what this webinar really aimed to, which is, let's try to look ahead and let's try to do all better, rebuild better for our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and all.
Thank you.